Okay, let's continue with part two of our discussion of governments and economies. And there are a couple of different models of power structures in the United States. There is what is called the power elite model, which says that there are elites in our society in terms of uh, wealth and power. And those individuals are on the boards of a lot of different companies, and all of those companies, there's kind of this web of very powerful people who exert more political control than they should. And then you have the pluralist model that says that you've got all these different competing groups that are fighting for scarce resources, you know, tax dollars and opportunity, and that it's all just kind of a game of competition, and that everybody has access to the opportunity to compete, if not the same access to the actual resources. So the power elite model says that society is ruled by a small group of individuals who share a common set of political and economic interests. C. Wright Mills developed this idea of the power elites, and he said that a small group of military, industrial, and government leaders control the fate of the United States. There's kind of a pyramid power structure there. You have the corporate rich, the executive branch, and military leaders. And there are interest group leaders, legislators, and local opinion leaders. And then there is the unorganized, exploited masses. Okay. And so that's the way that C. Wright Mills saw it. And there's a graphic representation there in figure 14-4, the power elite model. Um, Mills also said that the power elite operate as a self-conscious, cohesive unit. He said that the group has the same political and economic interests. They're all focusing on consolidating their power and increasing their wealth. This idea has challenged scholars to look more critically at the democratic political system of the United States. And then you have a competing idea about the power elite, and that is Domhoff's model. Domhoff stresses the roles played by elites of corporate community and leaders of policy formation organizations. He notes that the power elites still consist mainly of older white male and upper class individuals. But he says that in the electoral arena, there are two coalitions. There's the corporate coalition that is very conservative, and then there is the liberal labor coalition, and those two groups are competing for resources and power. Okay. So two different models of the power elite, but both exert this idea that there are a fairly small section of the population that controls most of what decisions are made for this country. The pluralist model, as I said, kind of takes a different approach. It says that there are many competing groups within our communities that have access to the government, so no one single group is going to dominate. It suggests that a variety of groups play a significant role in decision making, and I think there's probably some truth to both of these views, right? Generally speaking, I think that wealthy corporatists and military leaders and government bureaucrats make a lot of the decisions, but occasionally there are groups that the LGBT community, the Mothers Against Drunk Driving. There have been a number of entities that have been able to exert force on the government to get changes made to the law that will, in their view, benefit society and benefit themselves. So I think there's probably some truth in both of these ways of looking at society. The model has failed to note that it is largely a pluralism of white Americans from which racial and ethnic minorities are largely absent. So unfortunately, the pluralist model doesn't really acknowledge the lack of representation of minority groups, ethnic and racial minorities, and other groups that really have not had much of a seat at the table until fairly recently. I do think that other groups are now being heard. We're hearing more. The American Disabilities Act was an example of a situation where disabled people were able to gain access to public buildings and to knock down a lot of barriers that negatively impacted them. I think the same-sex marriage laws now that are the law of the land that allow gay couples to get married just as heterosexual couples are able to get married. I think that's another example of how some of these groups that historically have been denied opportunities to influence legislation are now having their voices being heard. Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about war. I think I may have mentioned in a previous video that war has been defined by some historians as theft on a national scale or an international scale. That war really is about competing for scarce resources and seizing those by force. War is defined as a conflict between organizations that possess trained combat forces equipped with deadly weapons. We used to refer to governments, but today with mercenaries, we have Blackwater and groups like that that are hired to go out and fight certain battles for us. And so we can't just say that it's, the military. There are other organizations that have to be included in that definition today. The legal definition typically requires a formal declaration of hostilities. There are three sociological approaches to war. The global view studies how and why nations become engaged in military conflict. The nation-state view stresses the interaction of internal political, socioeconomic, and cultural forces. And the micro view is going to focus on how the conflict can impact individuals and the groups that they belong to. Public opinion can certainly play a role when a leader determines if a country should go to war. So let's look at this. So let's kind of think about this a little bit. So if we take the global view and we're trying to study a particular conflict on a global scale, so let's say that we look at the Vietnam War, for example. The United States was fearful after the end of World War II that communism was going to become a threat all around the world. And so the idea of going into Vietnam was to try to stop the communist branch of Vietnam from taking over the government. And so that war was fought for that reason. And of course, communist China was in favor of a communist government, and so they supported Vietnam through supplying troops and weapons and things of that nature. And early on, our involvement in Vietnam involved just sending advisors over to try to help the resistance who were fighting against the communist Vietnamese to advise them in tactics. And over time, our involvement grew and grew, and eventually we lost 50,000 plus soldiers in that conflict before we finally were able to extricate ourselves from Vietnam. But the whole thing was this idea of stopping communism. Okay, so that would be kind of the global view. One country trying to influence the kinds of government that other countries could enforce on their people. Okay, the nation-state view of looking at that might look at what was going on here in the United States, the anti-war protests, the military advocating, hey, we've got to stop communism. We've got all these things going on here. We had, protesters and people being hit with water cannons and things of that nature, being shot with rubber bullets later on, and things of that nature for protesting the Vietnam War. And some of those protests got pretty violent and pretty out of control, right? And then when we look at it from the micro view, we might look at those soldiers who came back to the United States. They went to Vietnam to serve their country. They didn't really know why they had to travel halfway around the world and fight in a war that didn't seem to really impact their lives. What was going on in Vietnam before the war started, before they were sent there, didn't really have a lot of impact on their lives. They weren't being impacted by the communists in Vietnam, and so why are we being sent here to fight this war? No one has attacked us. We're not under threat of being attacked. Why are we traveling halfway around the world to fight a war that even many of our own citizens don't believe we should be here? And so, PTSD and studying the psychological impacts on people who experience warfare and conflict like that, and the health impacts of being, in the area where napalm and other toxic chemicals are being used. I have a cousin who died after he got back from Vietnam, many years after he got back, because of his exposure to Agent Orange and napalm and some of those chemicals that were used as a way to defoliate the jungle. Uh, and so he was exposed to a lot of those chemicals while he was over there in Vietnam, and ultimately he developed cancer and died as a result of that exposure. We're seeing a growing influence of women showing up in the U.S. military. They now account for 15% of active military forces, and they are now a part of combat units. Early on, when women were allowed into the military, they were only allowed in non-combat roles, but today women are joining combat units. And so we're also using drones and other technological advances to fight warfare, and I think that's only going to continue as time goes on. I think the military is probably looking at developing, a variety of non-human mechanized weapon systems to fight the wars. Okay, peace is defined as both as the absence of war and as a proactive effort to develop cooperative relationships among nations. So it's not just about the absence of war, it's also the absence of bullying and pressure and force being used, and more of a, hey, let's see how we can resolve these problems. Here's a common problem that the globe is dealing with, and here's what your country needs, and here's what our country needs. How can we work together to try to ensure that we both get what we need? That's what we mean by peace. It's not just the absence of war. It's also this actually promoting relations and trying to figure out how to take on problems that these countries have, that they can work together on, that they can resolve together. A number of alliances, NATO and the United Nations. These are entities that are organized to try to form relationships and eliminate war. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to do so, but we may have been able to avoid a number of wars because there is this government, this global community that can exert. When we went to the Middle East, when we went to Iraq, we had a coalition of a number of different countries that were working together to overthrow Saddam Hussein's government and to grant freedom to the citizens of Iraq. We can discuss the success of those efforts at another time, but that was the goal, right? So there is a thing called the Global Peace Index. It's based on 24 indicators, including just a few that I'll mention. Organized internal conflict, violent crime, political instability, the potential for terrorist acts, and a nation's level of military expenditures compared to its neighbor's level. And so in figure 14-5, you've got the Global Peace Index by nation. There are a number of nations there. I'll let you take a look at that, but that will kind of give you an idea of how the United States compares to other countries in terms of its score on the Global Peace Index. So let's talk a little bit about terrorism. That's something that we haven't really discussed this semester. Sometimes you get a discussion of terrorism in the crime and deviant behavior chapter. but we didn't really get into that in that chapter. Terrorism is defined as the use or threat of violence against random or symbolic targets in pursuit of political aims. So when I was growing up, we would hear about terrorism uh, in Great Britain and in Ireland, particularly Northern Ireland, where the Catholics and the Protestants were at each other's throats, and there would be bombings and car bombings and things of that nature. Later on, the terrorism that I heard about mostly was in Israel and the Middle East, where you'd have suicide bombers who would strap sticks of dynamite to their body and blow themselves up in a crowded marketplace or on a bus or something as a protest against the conflict in Israel. Israel was expanding out and taking over territory that other countries had claimed as their territory, and so there was all these conflicts in the Middle East. But today, more and more, we're starting to hear about domestic terrorism. We're hearing about groups like, the Proud Boys and QAnon and Antifa. I do want to make the point that Antifa does not appear at this time to be a well-organized group. It is a bunch of different groups that are opposed to fascism. That's where Antifa comes from, anti-fascists. But some of those groups have kind of morphed into some pretty violent activities, and that certainly is a concern. But the various intelligence services a few years ago did some research on domestic terrorism in the United States, and they determined that some of the white supremacy groups and the more radical groups on that end of the spectrum were more dangerous. They called them the radical right. Unfortunately, that report has really been scrubbed from government websites and things of that nature. It's a lot harder to get a hold of nowadays since we've had a president who, at least on the surface, has seemed to have a hard time, identifying the Proud Boys and who they are and what they stand for and whether he supports their aims or not. And so, in light of the current administration, there's been more of a focus on Antifa and less of a focus on white supremacists and other neo-Nazi groups that are located here in the United States. And I think, they do certainly pose a threat to our country and to our safety. But Antifa certainly, those cells of Antifa or those examples of Antifa that have engaged in violence should be denounced as well. But certainly we should have no hard time denouncing racist white supremacy groups and domestic terrorists like that. That should be an easy thing to do, I would think. Sociologists and others have studied the role of labeling and how behavior comes to be regarded as terrorism. If we examine how, the president has called certain groups thugs, the Black Lives Matter protests mostly were peaceful protests. There were situations where it broke out into violence. And in some cases, the violence wasn't coming from the Black Lives Matter protesters. It was coming from agitators who came in from outside the communities. And so, there's this whole question of who are the terrorists? Are the terrorists the people who are protesting the way police officers have interacted with people of color? Or are the terrorists the ones who are coming in and protesting against those counter-protesters who, exerting their views on us as well? So, I certainly do not condone violence from any group, but I will say that when you are a group that is disadvantaged and you've seen people decade after decade being treated unfairly and harshly by law enforcement and other entities within the government, legitimate entities, and you see that there is a lack of justice, at some point there does become a boiling over, and so it's not a surprise that groups that have been treated badly will eventually rise up and rebel against that. Having said that, again, I cannot condone the violence. Peaceful protests are certainly acceptable, and they're protected. The right to assemble and protest is guaranteed in our Constitution, but the right to burn down our neighbor's storefront because we are protesting is not guaranteed in the Constitution. So we have a right to express our views, but I also understand that at some point the frustration can boil over when you just hear of example after example of police using inappropriate levels of force against the very citizens that they are there to protect. Okay, so that's who gets to frame the question, who gets to label the individuals as terrorists. Was Timothy McVeigh a terrorist? I think most Americans would say yes, but you've got a few individuals out there who say that Timothy McVeigh was a patriot. And he bloodied the nose of the federal government by blowing up that building in Oklahoma City. Most Americans see that as an act of terrorism, and I certainly would agree with that. Okay. But the people that are in power are the ones often who are able to determine whether, or not to determine, but to label, affix a label of terrorist or patriot to a particular individual who commits an act against the government or an entity of the government. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about changing economies. There are a number of changes that we're seeing in economies today, and I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that, and we'll spend a little more time on economies and wrap up. Okay, so there are some trends that we can look at in capitalist societies. For example, there's a trend towards concentration of ownership by giant corporations. So corporations are, gaining power and wealth, and they are consolidating that and buying up more things and having a larger control of wealth and property here in the United States and in other capitalist countries. Especially those multinational corporations that we were talking about. There are five outgrowths of this trend in the United States. It's changing the face of the workforce. There is deindustrialization, and what that means is that a number of industries are moving overseas. They are moving their production facilities to countries that have cheaper labor costs due to a lack of a minimum wage or much lower minimum wages and fewer EPA regulations or environmental protection regulations and things of that nature. So we've talked about that before. We're seeing an increase in the sharing economy. People sharing cars, people sharing, people living together with people other than their family members today. So it's changing the way that people are living their lives in a variety of ways. We have boat shares. If you can't afford to own a boat, you can join a group where you pay a monthly fee, and you can go out on the weekend and take your family out in a boat that you don't own, but you are, again, kind of sharing that. Uber and Lyft are more examples of sharing economies. You can call up an Uber, or using your smartphone, ask for a ride, and they show up and take you where you need to go, and then you're charged a small fee for that. There's also a thing where you can join a group, and if you need a car, you can go to a place where there's a car, and you get that car and you drive it to where you need to go. And if they have a drop-off place at the other end of your journey, you can drop it off there, or you can bring it back to where you picked it up in the first place. So again, sharing economy. Scooters and bikes and things of that nature are also being shared in large cities. You join a service and you go ride their bike, and then you take it back and you're charged for the time that you use it. Those would be all examples of the sharing economy. We're seeing more temporary workforce. We're seeing more more employees having to work through temp organizations, whether they're construction workers or office workers. A lot more labor today is temporary, and that is because temporary laborers do not receive benefits, and so it's cheaper to hire them to do a job than it is to hire full-time employees, as long as they're well trained and as long as they can do the job. Okay, and then offshoring, and I've talked about that. That's part of that deindustrialization. We're seeing more corporations moving their assets off the shores of the United States so that they can hide assets better, and that reduces their tax liabilities and things of that nature. So all of these things are occurring as a result of the way our economy is becoming more centralized in the hands of a few corporations and wealthy organizations. So sociologists and labor specialists foresee a workforce increasingly composed of women and racial and ethnic minorities. There's going to be greater participation by minorities and women in the labor force going forward. It's been happening over the last 30 years, and I expect that to continue. If we look back just to 1950, we see that over 86% of men were in the labor force and 34% of women were in the labor force. But by 2025, it's projected that 66% of men and 55% of women will be in the labor force. Between 1996 and 2026, the proportion of the labor force composed of white, non-Hispanic workers is predicted to drop from 75% to 58%. That reflects some of the changing demographics of our country, but it also it's reflecting the changes in economic opportunities and educational opportunities as minorities have been able to take advantage of, particularly lower class minorities have been able to take advantage of Pell Grants and scholarships and things like that, and community colleges, to be quite honest. They've been able to gain educational credentialing that allows them to be more active participants in the labor market. So I think it's kind of a natural outgrowth of that. As I said, deindustrialization refers to the systematic, widespread withdrawal of investment in basic aspects of productivity, such as factories and plants. So we're not building very many factories in the United States these days. There are a few being built, but not very many. In spite of what President Trump has said, he has not been able to reverse the trend towards deindustrialization. Part of it is that investment is changing. The way that companies invest changes. They know they're going to get more bang for their buck if they build a factory in a country with lower labor costs than if they build a factory here in the United States. And also sometimes, trying to retrofit a factory is more complex and more expensive than going to a third world country, a developing country, and building a factory there. We don't try not to use the third world description anymore. We try to use the term developing countries, so I apologize for that. But generally, we are seeing less investment here in the United States and in other industrialized countries, and more investment in developing countries because there is more of a return on the dollars that are invested there. The need for labor decreases as we mechanize more, and so we're having fewer people working in factories. Even the factories that do still exist here, we're seeing more robots and computerized and other technological advances that have eliminated a lot of the jobs that people perform in factories. Companies are also relocating from cities to suburban areas, again, because it costs less to operate in a suburban area than it does in a large city. The property values are higher in a city in a lot of cases, and some of the problems that you encounter in a city with traffic issues and all those kinds of things are not quite so onerous in the suburbs. This can also take on the form of corporate restructuring. We also see some downsizing occurring as congruent with all these other trends that we're seeing. Downsizing refers to reductions taken in a company's workforce as part of that deindustrialization. So as we start moving jobs overseas and we start using more robotics, that means that we can cut the number of employees that we have. And that has led to unemployment and lots of issues in that regard. We've had plant closings and unemployment rates skyrocketing. Look at what has happened in Flint, Michigan, and Detroit, Michigan, and all those cities up there where they had automobile production facilities, and now those have closed up and moved to the South, or in many cases moved to other countries. That has had a tremendous impact on our economy here in the United States. The sharing economy, as I mentioned, refers to connecting owners of underused assets with others willing to pay to use them. Critics argue that the sharing economy is just an extension of the temporary workforce. Many peer-to-peer services were founded in the midst of the Great Recession, and we see that the sharing economy serves to commodify services that might otherwise have been given away for free. We mentioned the temporary workforce. There's an increasing reliance on part-time workers. Those workers are temporary or seasonal and lack benefits such as health insurance, sick leave, or unemployment compensation. The process was accelerated by economic downturn. You know, we had that housing bubble that burst back around, I guess it was about 2008, and we went through that Great Recession, and the economy, the tightening of the economy caused a lot of companies to start using temporary laborers because they just couldn't afford to hire on full-time laborers with benefits, full benefits, insurance, and all those kinds of perks, okay? In 2017, about 21 million Americans were working part-time because of non-economic reasons. Some workers seek out part-time jobs. In some cases, some people are working multiple part-time jobs just to try to make ends meet. And I've talked about offshoring, transferring work to foreign contractors. Reshoring can occur when companies bring jobs back to the United States. A number of companies try to move their call centers to other countries, for example, India, and people felt like they were not being treated properly by those companies, so they kind of protested against that, and some of those companies brought their call centers back to the United States, but not all have, okay? Companies can raise profits by reducing costs through offshoring. It increases economic interdependence between our economies and the economies of the countries that we offshore to. Benefits the upper middle class in developing countries, and other social class members don't really see the benefits of offshoring. Okay. So I think that's what we wanted to cover from our chapter on governments and economies. I hope that things are going well for you. Stay healthy and stay well, and we'll finish this semester strong, guys. Hang in there. This is it's an endurance race. It's not a sprint. Going to college and earning your degree is an endurance race, and sometimes when things just seem really bleak, you have to just keep in there, hang in there, stick it out, make it through the semester, get everything done you can on time, and hang in there and persist. It's about persistence, guys, and perseverance. So I know, you may be feeling like, oh my gosh, I'm just overwhelmed. I can't do all of this. We've all been there. Every student who's ever earned a college degree has at some point or another thought, maybe this is just more than I can do. Hang in there, keep working. Even if you don't achieve the grade that you desire for a particular class, keep working at it, stick to it. I've known students who would take a class 2 or 3 times before they got the grade they really wanted in the class. And, it's just that perseverance and that persistence that determines whether you're successful, not a grade in a particular semester. Okay, so stay after it, work hard, and stay well, and I'll see you soon.